So advertising, marketing, and branding is an interesting place. It's filled with different processes and different, it can be exciting, it can be fast paced. It's got a lot of stuff going on. And I know based on your different roles, you've talked about there are benefits that come with this process of doing advertising or marketing or branding type work. What are some of these benefits that you've identified over the years? And then the journal, we are in this business of looking at how that process of advertising impacts society and culture. So 2 questions, packing them in. Tell us about, this process of advertising and what its benefits are. And then how does that relate and how does that impact society and culture?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's an overall theme, and you might have picked up on it in the previous question, which is the things that I thought I dismissed as very light, I dismissed as very specific to a category, aka advertising and comms. I realized were actually the opposite of light and the opposite of category specific. And the kind of real benefit of the work that advertising does, and I still do some of that, is actually the meta skills that you learn when you have to do advertising well. And there are kind of two fundamental kinds of work that you do when you work in an ad agency that are very, very transferable and useful. One is reduction. So the science of sacrifice. In order to get to something that's simple and pithy and useful and creatively enriching, you have to reduce and reduce. You're making choices all the time. And then once you've got to that, you then expand out again. I would describe it as I can draw it, but I describe it as it looks like a bridge. So you've got a bow tie, you've got reduction, then expansion, and then reduction, and then expansion. It's basically there's a strategy bit, which is saying, well, what's the fulcrum? What's the kind of really core thought, often called a proposition or something, or an answer. Then you have this area of expansion, which is about creative development and playing around and working out, well, actually, what's the best way of answering that? And then you end up with one kind of core thought, and then it expands again. And that I've realized that that's actually again, having stepped away from things and then come back to them and also doing lots of other things, that is a very, very useful skill in almost everything you do, whether it's working for an organization in a business strategy or innovation pipeline, or whether you're just trying to work out what you do with your life. That's really fucking, I'm not allowed to swear, I'm going to get told. That's really helpful. I do swear a lot. I get told off. That's a really useful discipline. Also, the idea of, I think it's quite obvious, but it's something that ad people do really well when they do things well, is that they have a really good understanding of what a strategy is versus what the tactics that flow after that are. And I think when it's done badly, you end up with tactics that aren't cohesive and don't fit with the strategy. So that kind of fits with the bridge model, the bow tie thing. The other things, I think we're slightly obsessed with effectiveness because we're trying to prove our worth. And if you strip effectiveness back, and I've been a kind of president of the FEs and things like that. It's fascinating when you look at what really works and what doesn't. It's 2 things. It's a kind of flow of logic from here's the objective, whether it's commercial objective or behavioral objective, all the way down to the activity. And then once you've done that, once you're doing the activity, a flow of effects back up again. And that is a really useful model for anything, which is, even if you're writing an academic paper, who are you trying to influence? How are you trying to influence them? What activities are you going to do to persuade them and then back up again? That's a really powerful discipline that has been really helpful for me outside the industry, but it's because of the industry. There's also an attitude that you really notice it when you go into other industries. Advertising people, especially planners and creatives, tend to be curious and open-minded about what's going on. They have a really good sense of culture, what the shifts are, what isn't interesting and what isn't useful. And that is just one of those things. They tend to keep that over time. I like to think I'm in that bucket. I'm sure you are. But it's one of those things. It's a really nice, useful growth mindset at the heart of it. What else? I think there's also, perhaps we can talk about brand strategy later, but the idea that what makes a really good brand strategy is also what makes a really good business strategy, which is, I always use metaphors, which is it gives you roots and wings. So you have a really clear sense of who and what you are, but it also allows you to fly off and do other things, but while staying rooted. And that is not an easy, that's the essence of a really good business strategy, especially if you're trying to deal with difficult, challenging ethical and environmental agendas that may not be fitting with your business. And maybe we should talk about that later, because that's one of the biggest challenges I think we have. There's also this idea of, what is the idea of you? What is the notion that holds you together? Ad agencies are really good at finding ideas and delivering on them, and they know what they are and they know what they're not. And that for me is really helpful. I mean, as I was kind of reflecting on what those kind of meta skills are, if I come back to my journey, I realized in the last 3 or 4 years, I realized that the conversations I was having in the business space were also very, very similar to the conversations I was having in the personal space. And I've got this kind of thought, I don't think it's a new thought, but for me, it was a really important one, which is, behind every business problem and opportunity lies a human one. And you have to come back to people, because it's people who start companies, it's people who keep them alive, it's people who understand companies better than anybody else, are the people within those organizations. To separate those two things always feels a bit weird to me. And there's also some kind of fundamental questions that, again, came from the advertising world, which is, what makes you special? And they want you to find out what keeps you special over time, not 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And how does that evolve as you evolve? And then also the other kind of key thing was, I'm sorry, I might have gone off piece slightly, but is the idea of, and this is something I'm working on at the moment, is like the idea of an idea being the basic unit of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the basic unit of business, but it's also the basic unit of life, because an idea is, in my simple way of thinking about it, is it takes you from point A to point B, but it also, at a functional level, but also at an emotional level, it is, and this sounds quite cheesy, but it's something that lights the fire and then lights the way. So you know what to do with it. And it's the ideas that people get up in the morning for. It's ideas that make people want to change their life and be different and be happy. And so I realized all these things are kind of flowing into one kind of thing, but I wouldn't have got anywhere near those things if I hadn't had the background in advertising and that creative thinking process. And also there's one thing I didn't mention, which is this obsession with the consumer. I don't like the word consumer, but the obsession with people and how they tick and what makes them interesting and what they're looking for. It means that somebody who's worked in advertising is really, really well placed to deliver on a lot of the challenges that most companies and organizations and will face. But again, I wouldn't have realized any of that stuff if I hadn't stepped away from it for a bit. I think that's, God, I could keep talking about that for a long time, because there's lots of, I realized there were kind of 3 buckets of work, and it was similar to the bridge model I was talking about, which is there are kind of 3 areas. One is the ability to reflect and look. I call it dead reckoning for humans. The dead reckoning is the naval term for pre-GPS, how you worked out where you were. And the thing is, you can't work out where to go until you've worked out where you were and how you got there. So for me, there's a lot of thing about being reflective and looking into how you got to where you are, and what you should keep and what you should not keep. And then there's a bucket around, I call it realization, which is just working out what you're trying to do in the world. So that's who you're fighting for, what you're fighting against, what your principles are, what your weapons are. Just, there's a whole load of metaphors and analogies that are really helpful on unpacking it. And then the realization bit is effectively effectiveness, which is if that's what you want to do, how do you create systems and goals and partnerships that allow you to deliver on that? And it's all based on the same stuff that comes from the learnings that, nothing's really changed in terms of my brain. I've just applied those things to different places and they're still really useful. If that makes sense.
Yeah.